The small police force from Benin City had arrived in Ugbo earlier that morning, their battered pickup trucks kicking up dust as they pulled into the village. They had orders to search every house, every hut, and every farm for signs of Lawrence. Anini, rumor had it that the infamous robber was hiding in one of the nearby villages, and Ugbo was next on their list. At the village square, Inspector Okoro stood with his hands on his hips, his eyes scanning the faces of the villagers who had gathered to watch. He was a stocky man, with a thick mustache and a permanent scowl etched on his face. "Listen to me," Inspector Okoro barked. "We're looking for Lawrence Anini. Anyone caught hiding him will face the full wrath of the law. You all know what this man has done: robbery, murder, and worse. If you know anything, speak up now." The crowd murmured nervously, but no one stepped forward. The villagers of Ugbo, like many others, had mixed feelings about Anini. On the one hand, he was a criminal who had killed policemen and stolen large sums of money. But on the other hand, he had a reputation for helping the poor and standing up against a corrupt system. To some, he was a necessary evil in a world filled with injustice. Among the crowd was a young man named Ego Daro. Known to his friends as Eo, he was quiet and unassuming, working as a farmer on the outskirts of the village. Eo had always kept to himself, but today, something in his eyes suggested he was hiding something. Inspector Okoro paced in front of the villagers, frustration growing in his voice. "We know Anini has friends in these villages. He cannot be far. If you know where he is, now is the time to speak." Still, no one spoke, as the police moved from house to house, questioning villagers and searching for clues. Eo slipped away from the square, his heart pounding in his chest. He had a secret, one he had kept for the past few days, and it was eating him alive. Just 3 nights ago, Eo had been returning home from the farm, when he had stumbled upon a man lying in the bushes, wounded and barely conscious. It wasn't until he got closer that he realized who the man was: Lawrence Anini himself. Anini had been shot in a skirmish with the police, and though he had managed to escape, he was badly injured. In that moment, Eo had faced a choice: leave the man to die or help him. Despite the fear that gripped him, Eo chose to help. He had carried Anini to an old, abandoned house on the edge of the village, a place no one visited anymore. There, he had tended to the robber's wounds in secret, bringing him food and water when no one was watching. Now, as the police closed in on the village, Eo felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. If they found out he had been harboring Anini, his life would be over. But if he turned the man in, could he live with himself? That night, Eo returned to the old house. Anini lay on a makeshift bed, his face pale but his eyes alert. The robber had been regaining his strength, though the wound in his side still caused him pain. "They're searching the village," Eo said quietly as he entered the room. "The police are looking for you." Anini smiled faintly, his voice weak but steady. "Let them look. They won't find me here." Eo frowned, pacing the small room. "I can't keep this up much longer. If they find out I'm helping you, they'll kill me." Anini's smile faded, and for the first time since Eo had found him, a shadow of vulnerability crossed his face. "You've already done more for me than anyone else would have. I don't blame you if you want to turn me in." Eo stopped pacing and looked at the man lying before him. The legendary Lawrence Anini, a man feared by the police and loved by the poor. Was Lawrence Anini himself? But here, in this small room, he was just a man, wounded and cornered. "I won't turn you in," Eo said softly. "But we need to figure out a way out of this." As the days passed, the tension in the village grew. The police continued their search, and Inspector Okoro became more desperate, ordering his men to harass the villagers in hopes of getting information. The people of Ugbo grew restless, and whispers of rebellion began to spread. Meanwhile, Eo and Anini devised a plan. Anini needed to get out of Ugbo, but the police had set up roadblocks on every major route. The only way out was through the dense forest to the north, a dangerous path, filled with wild animals and treacherous terrain. "I know the way," Eo told Anini one night, as they sat in the dim light of the old house. "I've traveled through the forest before. It's risky, but it's our only chance." Anini nodded, wincing as he shifted his position. "I trust you, Eo, but once we're out, you'll need to leave me. I can't let you risk your life for me any more than you already have." Eo hesitated, but eventually agreed. The plan was simple: under the cover of darkness,
They would slip out of the village and make their way through the forest. Once they reached the other side, Anini would go his own way, and Io would return to Ugbo as if nothing had happened. Io helped Anini to his feet. On the night of the escape, the village was eerily quiet, and the two men slipped out of the abandoned house, moving quickly and quietly toward the edge of the forest. The moonlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground as they made their way deeper into the woods. But as they reached the forest's edge, they heard the sound of voices police officers patrolling the area. Io's heart raced as he and Anini crouched behind a large tree, watching the officers pass by. For a moment, it seemed they had avoided detection, but then a flashlight beam swept over them, and a voice shouted, "There they are! It's Anini!" Panic surged through Io's chest as the officers gave chase. He and Anini darted into the forest, dodging branches and leaping over fallen logs as they ran for their lives. Behind them, the sound of footsteps and shouts grew louder. Anini stumbled, his wound slowing him down. But Io grabbed his arm and pulled him forward. "Come on, we're almost there." The forest was thick, and the darkness made it difficult to see. But Io knew the way. He led Anini through the trees, pushing them both to the limit. Suddenly, a gunshot rang out, and Anini cried out in pain, falling to the ground. Io skidded to a stop, his heart pounding in his ears as he knelt beside the wounded man. "Io," Anini gasped, his face pale. "You need to go. Leave me." But Io shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. "I can't leave you here. Not like this." Anini smiled weakly, his hand gripping Io's arm. "You've done enough, my friend. Go, live your life. Don't let them take you too." With a heavy heart, Io nodded. He knew that if he stayed, they would both be caught. He stood up, his legs trembling, and looked down at Anini one last time before turning and running deeper into the forest. Behind him, the sound of the police closing in grew louder, but Io kept running, disappearing into the night. The next morning, the villagers of Ugbo awoke to the news that Lawrence Anini had been captured. The police had found him in the forest, wounded and barely conscious, but alive. Inspector Okoro paraded him through the village square like a trophy, his victory over the infamous criminal finally complete. But as the villagers watched, there was no cheering, no celebration. Instead, there was a sense of quiet sadness. Anini had been a criminal, yes, but too many. He had also been a symbol of resistance against a corrupt system that had oppressed them for so long. Io stood at the edge of the crowd, his heart heavy with guilt and relief. He had made it out of the forest, but Anini had not. The man who had been both a hero and a villain was now in the hands of the law, and his fate was sealed. As the days passed, the story of Lawrence Anini's capture spread far and wide. Some called him a villain, others called him a hero. But for Io, the truth was somewhere in between. Anini had been a man of flawed, complicated man, who had lived by his own rules in a world that had pushed him to the edge. And in the end, he had made a choice to trust someone, to let go, and to face the consequences of his actions. And so, the legend of Lawrence Anini lived on, not just as a tale of crime and punishment, but as a story of humanity, of choices, and of the thin line between good and evil.